Hi everyone, it's Ali here with more songwriting tips for you. In this lesson I want to talk about using repetition in songwriting. A lot of beginner songwriters often try and stay away from using repetition for fear of being unoriginal, or they simply just don't realise the importance of it and so don't use it enough. And I want to show you why not using repetition enough or avoiding it altogether can actually be hurting your songwriting. So in this lesson I'm going to give you my top tips on using repetition in songwriting. So what is it that makes repetition in songwriting so important? We don't see repetition used in other art forms anywhere near as much as we do in songwriting. So what makes it so prevalent in songwriting? Firstly, we find repetition compelling. Elizabeth Margulis also wanted to know what makes repetition so important in songwriting, so she ran an experiment. She took a piece of classical music by composer Luciano Berio and digitally edited it, copying sections to make it more repetitive. Berio was a 20th century composer who had actively moved away from using too much repetition. She wanted to see if copying sections to make it more repetitive would make people like his music more. She then played the two versions to people and had them evaluate the music. The listeners consistently rated the repetitive version as more enjoyable, more interesting, and more likely to have been composed by a human artist rather than randomly generated by a computer. Secondly, without repetition, we can't use contrast in our songs to add interest and unpredictability. Without an established pattern, it's impossible to create contrast. Building up a pattern using repetition gives us the opportunity to use contrast in our songs. When it comes to writing our songs, if we have a melody we want the listener to become familiar with as quickly as possible, but we want to disguise the repetition so they don't get bored of it too quickly, we can either change the order in which the repetition is heard by including other sections in between, or change the way in which the melody is heard, for instance taking it from a vocal melody and changing it onto an instrument. A melody that repeats in each section is going to be more obvious to the listener than a melody that's broken up by a different contrasting idea in between. Say you have a verse and a chorus that use the same melody, but you then place in between it a pre-chorus that uses a different melody. That contrast is going to break up the repetition and make it less obvious to the listener. Take a look at E.T. by Katy Perry, Born in the USA by Bruce Springsteen, You Are Not Alone by Michael Jackson, and Let's Go Crazy by Prince. All these use the same melody in the verse and the chorus. E.T. and You Are Not Alone use the pre-chorus to break up the repetition, making it less obvious to the listener. So where can we use repetition in our song? What are the elements that make up a song that need to use repetition? First off, and probably most important, melody. Repetition in our melody is probably one of the most important keys when it comes to writing a great song. Studies have shown that the more we hear a melody, the more we actually like it. And once we like that melody, we're going to end up singing along. So if we want people to sing our songs, we need to give them as much chance to hear the melody as possible by repeating it throughout the song. A melody that repeats allows the listener to shift their focus elsewhere within the song, for example to the lyrics. If you've got strong lyrics and you want the listeners to be focusing on them, it's a great idea to repeat the melody as much as possible beneath the lyrics so they can focus on the lyrics instead. Melodies are often broken down into smaller phrases or motifs that can then be reused throughout your song or even other songs. You may think this is a bit uncreative, a bit boring, a bit obvious for the listener. You may even think of it as cheating. But as I've said before, the repetition actually allows the listener to engage with our song on a deeper level. The other elements of the melody that we might want to repeat are the rhythm and the intervals. I won't go into either of those here, but have a go at analysing some of your favourite songs and see if you can see how they reuse those ideas. The next place we can use repetition in our song is of course the lyrics. Now we all understand that when it comes to the chorus, we're going to repeat those lyrics each time the chorus comes around. Or if we're using a refrain, we'll repeat that single line, whether it's at the start of the verse or the end of each verse. But what other parts of the lyrics can we repeat? Firstly, syllables. If we're keeping the melody the same between each section, say from verse 1 to verse 2, The bare bones of that melody when it comes to the lyrics are the syllables. And we're going to want to keep that syllable count at least close to the same each time. If you're altering your syllable count, you're also going to be altering the melody, and that may or may not be what you want. Next is the rhyme scheme. Now you don't have to keep this the same between each verse or between each section, but you may want to, particularly between the verses. It's a good idea generally to add contrast by changing the rhyme scheme between, say, your verse and your chorus, or your chorus and your bridge, but you probably want to keep the rhyme scheme the same between each verse. You certainly don't want it to be drastically different. So when you're writing your songs, just make sure you repeat the rhyme scheme between your verses. Thirdly, the theme of the lyrics. You're going to want to make sure you're constantly repeating that theme throughout your song. Everything needs to lead back to that theme, and it needs to be really obvious to the listener what your whole song is about. Obviously, it's what the chorus sums up, that's what the hook's all about, is summing up that main theme. So know your theme and constantly reference back to it. Lastly, I want to look at the structure of the lyrics. Take a look at the lyrics to Hey Jude by the Beatles. All the verse lyrics use repetition of a few key phrases as structure for the lyrics. If this is something you've not tried, it's a great idea for giving you structure throughout your lyrics. Next, I want to focus on repetition within the structure of the whole song. You may think repetition within the structure of a song is really obvious, since all structures use repetition to some degree. But right now I want to focus on the chorus repetition. Researchers have found that the more a chorus is repeated, the more popular that song will be. More repetitive songs were more likely to chart in the top 40. In fact, each repetition of the chorus increased the likelihood a song would make it to the top 40 by a whole 17%, and increased the chance it was number one hit by 14.5%. Now, you may not be trying to write a hit song, you may not even particularly like pop music, but if you want to get your main message across and communicate that as clearly as possible, you're going to want to repeat your chorus as much as possible within the structure of your song. Obviously, you're going to have to work out a balance between repeating it enough that people can get a grasp of your main message and repeating it so much that they get bored of it. But obviously, that's something you always have to weigh up as you write your song. The next part of our song where we can use repetition is the harmony. Now, I think most people would consider repetition in the harmony to be pretty obvious. I think most people would expect you to repeat your harmony between each verse or between each chorus. They'd find it pretty unusual to change that. You also potentially don't even really need to change harmony between the chorus and the verses. There are quite a lot of songs that use the same harmony throughout the whole song. And obviously, it's very common to see the same chord sequence used in multiple songs. You don't have to analyse too many songs or learn to play too many songs before you see the same chord sequences cropping up time and time again. Just look at a basic 1, 5, 6, 4 chord sequence. This list is just a handful of songs from all different styles of music that all use this same chord sequence. So don't feel the need to really change up the harmony through each section. You can do, and if you want to get into reharmonization, particularly if you're into jazz, you can do a lot of complex stuff that way and it can sound amazing, but you certainly don't have to. And if you're a beginner songwriter, it's a really great idea just to take a very common chord sequence and try writing along to that. Plenty of your songs use the same chord sequences, you don't have to try and reinvent the wheel every time. Ultimately, you're going to want to find a balance when using repetition within your song. You don't want your song to just become boring and monotonous just because you're using the same parts over and over again. But at the same time, using that repetition helps to give your listener some familiarity when they're listening to your song. So that's it for this lesson. I hope you found it helpful. If you haven't done already, please hit the thumbs up below. Please share this with anyone that you think might find it helpful, and please hit subscribe if you want to see more of this content in the future. That's it for me today, and I'll see you again in the next video.